So first of all, I want to, number one, welcome our guests, and I'm going to formally introduce the both of you a little bit later. I want to welcome everybody on this call. Thank you very both much for attending. MK Wonch, I know it's evening, but so thank you very much for taking time out. For those of you on the call who don't know me, my name is Oded Orgil, and I'm president of the Canada-Israel Chamber of Commerce. I'm thrilled to host our two guests today. Recently, we've relaunched the Chamber. We're very excited about that. We've hosted approximately 7 events in the last 3 months on a variety of different topics. In the next week or week and a half, we're going to be relaunching our website. So please have a look out for that. And over the last 3 months, we've actually launched a newsletter, updating some of the events that we've had and other agenda items that we're looking forward to. And I'd be remiss if I didn't thank, our marketing team, Naomi, Sana, Ardita, as well as our administrative assistant, Patricia, and Liora Abramovich, who's been working behind the scenes as our director of corporate development. There's no way we would have done this without that group, and I want to thank them very much for all their hard work over the last 3-4 months. As I mentioned earlier, I'm thrilled to have these two women and guests speak today. With all that's going on in the world and in Israel, there is no way, especially if we want to learn a little bit about them, that we're going to cover all this in an hour. So we're going to limit it. That being said, I am going to make sure that as many questions as people have, please add them into your chat. I have a list of questions because I'm very interested in speaking to both of them, but we want to make sure as many of the people on are engaged, and feel free to jump on and ask questions. I'll fit that in. As I said, we're looking at more of a fireside chat today. My hope is to ask them both some questions. I had a brief interchange with the Consul General, and she's used to being formal in introducing. I've told her we're going to ask questions about you. We want to learn more about you as opposed. So I hope she's prepared for that. And without further ado, I'm going to take a moment and just give you all a very brief bio of all of these two women and all that they've accomplished in their life. So I just want to I'll start with member of Knesset Wunsch. Michal Wunsch she's a member of the Knesset with the Blue and White Alliance. She currently serves as the chair of the Special Committee on Drug and Alcohol Use. She is chair of the Subcommittee on Israel-Diaspora Relations, and as a member of the Foreign Affairs, Security, Law, Children's Rights, Women's Rights, Immigration and Integration Committees. She's also chair of the Canada-Israel Friendship Group, the Knesset's official representative on matters related to the International Criminal Court, and a founding member of the Interparliamentary Task Force to combat online anti-Semitism. Michal was born in Israel, grew up in Canada, and we're going to ask her a little bit about that. She got her LLB from Hebrew University, that's a law degree for those of you who don't know, and her master's in law from McGill University in Canada. She's a PhD candidate in the Human Rights Under Pressure Ethics, Law and Politics program at Hebrew U in Yerushalayim, and a Freire Universitaire at Biram, researching freedom of speech, civil liberties, democratic theories, and multiculturalism. She spent some time in the private sector. She hasn't been a professional politician her whole life. And she's committed to promoting, advancing, protecting the rule of law, human rights, Israeli diaspora relations, and Jewish communities throughout the world. And she's also a mother and a spouse. So Michal, thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to turn over, I'll make a brief introduction of Galit. And again, if I went fully into both of all these women have accomplished, that would probably take about 25 minutes. So I'm going to be brief. Galit was born in Jerusalem in 1969. Her academic background includes a bachelor's degree in archaeology and English from Tel Aviv U, followed by a master's degree, in American Studies from Hebrew University in Yerushalayim. She speaks Hebrew, English, and Russian. Her international postings include stops at the Consular of Public Affairs at the Israeli Embassy in Washington, time in Cairo, as well as in Moscow, and most recently, obviously, here in Canada. She began her career in the ministry as a political assistant to the Director General's Bureau with the Department of Eurasia and Caucasia at the ministry headquarters in Jerusalem. Later, she held positions as Deputy Director in the same department, as well as Director of Department for Palestinian Affairs and Regional Cooperation, which we may hopefully get a chance to touch on that as well. about 4 years ago. She arrived just 4.5 years ago. She arrived in Canada with her family. She is also married and she has children, and her husband is also a diplomat with the Israeli government. So there, thank you both very, very much again for joining us today. And let me start, if I may, is that, and also, as I said, in the true spirit of Israeli casualism, both of them have allowed me to call them by their first name. So I thank you both very much for that. So my first question, if I can, to you, Michal, and this is a little bit near and dear to my heart, because I have a son who's now a lone soldier in Israel. And I know that you did that. I mean, you were, again, born in Israel. I would call it your formative upbringing was a little bit with here in Canada. And then you returned to Israel to serve as a lone soldier. Maybe tell us a little bit about what made you do that, how maybe your parents reacted, and just your experience, because I don't know if people really understand what that's all about.
First of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. I appreciate it so much, and it's really, truly an honor. And even just that question is a testament to how important these engagements are. So thank you for the opportunity. Indeed, you're right. My first few years of life, I was born in Jerusalem, grew up in Jerusalem, with a very, very distinct, I would say, political upbringing from a very young age. My mother, Ariella, was the parliamentary secretary for the Likud party at the time for Menachem Begin, actually the night of what's known as the Mahapach in Hebrew. Actually, a new word was coined in that 1977 night. I sat in the cafeteria of the Knesset alongside giants, historic, real giants. They were all quite short, actually, in retrospect, but Esther Ziel Naob and Zion Kishit, Yechiel Kadishai, giants of a magnitude that are hard to recall at this point. But I was the beneficiary of knowing them alongside, of course, Menachem Begin and Eliza Begin. And really, those formative years, I would say, unknowingly, undoubtedly shaped my return to Knesset many, many years later, over 40 years later. Indeed, my mum, who married Professor Erwin Kotler, who some of you may be familiar with, and who ultimately became my dad, lucky for me, and gave me the opportunity for siblings and a family. We moved to Montreal at a very young age, and I like to say that actually the experience of new immigrants is really never fully understood until you arrive somewhere without language. And if I have to recall the arrival in Canada, not only without French, but without English, because I arrived to Montreal, of course, I can tell you that there are moments that one does not forget, and the understanding and also the empathy that comes with the personal experience of feeling what it is to be the new person on the block is really something that I take with me very, very deeply into my commitments now in Knesset as well. Indeed, my formative years were in Montreal, and I'm the beneficiary of a wonderful education and Canadian understanding of both identity and multiculturalism and pluralism, really in the truest senses. And what I like to call, when I sit around the committee tables in Knesset, good governance, long-term policies, holistic strategies. Really, I'm truly the beneficiary of understanding many things that Canada does so very well. And having experienced, of course, human rights struggles of a very, very historic magnitude, whether it's the plight of Soviet Jewry alongside my father's representation of many of the, well-known, of course, refuseniks alongside Anatoly Sharansky, Natan Sharansky, ultimately Ida Nudel, and many, many others, and human rights generally, the commitment to human rights as a representative of Nelson Mandela and so forth, and really a deep understanding as a young child in those formative years of the imperative that we affirm international law and that human rights become really our raison d'etre and what makes us ensure that we as trustees of international law and human rights uphold, promote, and protect them as the foundations of what it is that we were meant or entrusted with the imperative to never again in a world of again and again. So when I tell people that around our very often dinner table, we heard of the Tutsis and the Hutus and the genocide in Rwanda. When I mean, today it's the Uyghurs in China, but unfortunately, we really are living in a world that is challenged, that is ailed by human rights violations and the I would say, growing and continued culture of impunity that is enabled when double standards are allowed to thrive. And when by double standards, I mean the application of I would say not or inconsistent application of international law and human rights. So now I'm going to get to the lone soldier part. Coming to Israel, actually, for me, was about the one-year program at Hebrew University at the time. I did not intend to enlist, and I hope your son didn't do this to you. At some point, when the year ended, I decided that the right thing to do was to enlist into the army, because it was just random that I got to go back to McGill and go to med school while my friends, new Israeli friends, had to go into the army. And so I arrived at the recruitment office and called my parents from there, because I was not 18 yet, for their permission on a Sunday morning to enlist into the army. And that's how they found out that I had made my big decision. I hope your son didn't do that. Now, seriously, no, he didn't do that. In all seriousness, and this is very important for people to know in terms of lone soldiers, of course, my commitment to acknowledging the significance of being a lone soldier at a very trying time. And actually, COVID-19 brings with it a whole new set of challenges for lone soldiers, and I think all new immigrants, probably in every country, but certainly I see them in this country, the challenges of new Olim not being able to see families, not being able to receive visits. But at the end of the day, lone soldiers at the time when I served in the army, 30 years ago plus, really the system didn't know what to do with us. And so we were basically on our own. We sort of had to fend for ourselves. We got a gift, twice a year, and that was about it. The advantage of that was, and I tell this to parents of lone soldiers all the time, so I'm sort of telling it to you, Oded, the advantage of that was that we coped, or our coping was while we were in the army. And ultimately, when we were released from the army, we already knew where we were. We were in Israel, where we had to fend for ourselves. I think that the incredible progress that has been made in terms of support for lone soldiers over these 30 years leaves us at for me, a very distinct realization that all that's happened is that adaptation stage, or the need to really understand what it is and integrate into Israeli society, has just been pushed off in many ways. And so when a lone soldier is released from the army, there's actually a whole slew of challenges, of difficulties that did not exist in the past. And it's something that I'm very preoccupied with, including, as a member of Knesset in the Aliyah and Klita Committee, in terms of not only acknowledging that, but making accommodations so that we know that we are there to absorb that. And we have to remember that as it is, and anybody who's served in the army will be able to understand what I mean, when a democratic citizen of a democratic country enters a hierarchy, which is what the army is, it's very shocking. But it's no less shocking when that democratic citizen who's become adjusted to a hierarchic system is then thrown back into democracy and told, good luck.
Go fend for yourself.
Exactly. And when you're a lone soldier, that is multiplied, because there is very little guidance. There is not a home you come back to and sort of figure things out. And we have to make those accommodations and understandings, both as members of Knesset and as parents and as communities. So that is my very long answer to the experience and how that's changed as a lone soldier.
Wonderful. Michal, thank you. I mean, I very much appreciate it. Gali, you've had a more growing up, obviously, a more traditional Israeli early stage. Perhaps touch on that. But what I'm interested with you is, obviously, what pushed you, or what was your calling to get into the diplomatic service? And as I mentioned in your bio, you've had some very, very prestigious posts: Cairo, Moscow, the United States. Maybe tell us even what's the most interesting one you have. I mean, other than Canada, we know is the best, but but maybe just tell us a little bit what got you into the diplomatic service and some of your unique experiences abroad.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Oded, for this introduction. A word to member of Knesset, Michal Kotler-Wunsch. First of all, I would like to congratulate the Knesset member for the appointment of her father, Erwin Kotler. He was appointed this week as Canada's special envoy for promoting Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. One of the most impressive people I've met here. I'm very honored to have met him, and I just have compliments about this wonderful family representing both in Israel, encapsulating the wonderful relations between Canada and Israel. So congratulations, MK Kotler-Wunsch, if you could please send my warmest greetings to your father. When it comes, and we also have quite a few subjects to discuss when it comes to lone soldiers. I need to mention that the Consulate General in Toronto is third in the world among Israeli diplomatic missions in the volume of consular services that are provided here. And among the many responsibilities and activities, we also take care of families, of bereaved families, Israeli families that live here in Canada, wounded soldiers, and of course, anything that is related to lone soldiers and to service in Israel. So, Michal, if I may address you in your first name in a very Israeli manner, I'd love to continue this conversation separately. When it comes to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, a couple of words. I was not planning on becoming a diplomat. My first experience with the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs was actually a very negative one. I spent several years in the United States with my parents. We lived in the greater Washington area. And I practiced, I played the piano at the time. I took it very seriously, practiced for hours every day. And the original plan was to become a concert pianist. I participated in competitions, in recitals. I probably wasn't good enough. But at that age, at the age of 16, this is what I wanted to do with my life. And I don't remember how. I heard there was supposed to be a recital at the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. And I decided to go and to the concert. I didn't know that you cannot just walk into an embassy, a diplomatic mission. At the age of 16, with this naivety, I got all dressed up. I was very excited about it. And I took the metro, I took the subway, and I was stopped at the gates of the embassy in Washington, D.C. by Israeli security personnel who very gently told me that I was not allowed in. For me, as an Israeli citizen, a 16-year-old who at that time already received the first letter from the recruitment center through the embassy, it was a terrible insult. And I promised myself maybe at that time already that one day the gates will be open for me. But I completely forgot about it. I moved on with my life. The family returned to Israel. I did my military service, obtained a bachelor's degree from Tel Aviv University. And at a certain point, I applied to the cadet course of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, hesitantly, because at that time there weren't too many women who applied, but I had a very dear person close to me at the time who convinced me repeatedly, over and over again, convinced me to apply. He said, you should do it, you should give it a try. And I thank him, and I'm grateful to him for this wonderful advice, because after a whole year of interviews and exams and tests and evaluation centers, I was notified that I was accepted to the very prestigious cadet course of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In 1994, when I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, out of 50 people who were recruited to that cadet course, a few months after the Oslo Accords were signed with the Palestinians, out of these 50 cadets, only 10 were women. Out of these 10, 5 were supposed to become administrators, consuls and heads of administration in missions abroad. Only 5 of them were political, and I was one of them. And at the time, I found it extremely overwhelming when I found myself in my particular group of cadets with 17 men. I was the only woman. And of course, it attracted a lot of attention, tremendous attention. We visited places in Israel. We learned about Israeli society from different perspectives and points of view. I was the only woman, and there were always remarks about that. And I'm very glad to see the growing number of women who are joining the foreign ministry today. I chose to compete for the most challenging positions. I served in Moscow, I served in Cairo, and at the embassy in Washington, D.C. I was director of the Department for Palestinian Affairs, one of the most challenging and frustrating positions at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I insisted on being becoming head of a diplomatic mission in North America. And again, here, out of 14 positions of heads of mission, there are only 2 women, myself in Toronto and my colleague in Atlanta. And again, I felt it was my responsibility as a woman to break this glass ceiling, to make a statement out of serving, making a point out of serving in the most challenging diplomatic missions and encouraging other women, younger diplomats, to follow me. So this is how I ended up here, and it's a wonderful place. I'm grateful for every single day that I work here in Toronto.
Gali, thank you so much. I want to take this a little bit further. I mean, and what I mean by that is you touched on the fact that the disparity in certain, whether it's the foreign ministry of men and women. An interesting article last week that the 2 of you may or may not have seen, which I found very interesting, was MasterCard in its index of women entrepreneurs. Israel rose from 4th to 1st in 2020, which is wonderful. I mean, ahead of the US, Switzerland, New Zealand. Canada did finish top 10, but Israel was ahead. That said, I'd like to ask both of you, maybe I'll start with you, Gali, this time, because you brought up, is what is Israel doing right? But also, what is Israel doing wrong, or what can it very much improve on? Because as the father of 2 daughters, again, this is, I know I get beaten on the head, but I want them, maybe they should be in Israel, should they be in Canada?
Well, thank you for bringing it up. This is something that I give it a lot of thought to. You know, when I grew up and I read many adventure books, I was an avid reader, hundreds and thousands of books that I read at that age. Unfortunately, not anymore. Now I read mainly documents. But at that time, I remember that in adventure books, I never wanted to be the damsel in distress, the princess. I always wanted to be the knight. I wanted to be the warrior. And this is how I raised my daughter as well. I have a son and a daughter. And it's important for me that she feels confidence in her body. She feels confidence with the many challenges that are facing her as a young woman. She's a teenager. And I believe this is the responsibility, first of all, of education and upbringing. I grew up in a house with 2 grandmothers who worked constantly, who provided for their family. They were the breadwinners in the family. My mother as well always worked. And I believe that parents, first of all, mothers and grandmothers, should function as role models for their children. At the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the Israeli government in general, there is a growing realization that more should be done and could be done in order to integrate women better into not only to the workforce, but to more influential positions in Israeli society. And I will give you a few examples. The major game changer, the equalizer in Israeli society, in my view, is military service. And I remember that when I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I worked with a team of psychologists, and I worked as an upgraded maybe secretary. That was mainly the responsibility that was given to women in the 1980s when I did my military service. But in the 1990s, we could already see a dramatic shift in the military, with more openings, more options that were provided for women in the Air Force, in cadet corps, in joining the elite units in the Israeli army, including the intelligence corps, technological units, and so on. And I believe that if you serve in the right unit in the army, if you make the right connections, if you create your networking already during your military service, this is definitely something that will support you later on in life. And we see that happening with a growing number of women in combat units, in integrated battalions on the borders of Israel, where they receive tremendous responsibility, where they learn to operate advanced systems and they're confident. And later on, when they continue to university and they enter the workforce, they come with this confidence and expertise that are rare in the general public. I think this is wonderful. This is one thing that is happening in Israel, empowerment of women already during their military service. A second thing, and I will just mention it shortly, there is awareness at the Israeli Innovation Authority and other governmental organizations that there are certain areas, certain sectors in which women should be supported. There are plenty of programs that are offered, especially in the periphery, on technology, on science, for teenagers, for young girls, in math, in sciences, in computer science. And we see a growing number of young girls who are interested in these subjects, and they don't shun them anymore. They're not hesitant about studying something that is considered almost masculine or used to be considered masculine in the past. There are two sectors that are still problematic in Israeli society. One of them is Muslim women who are highly educated, very well educated in Israel. There is great potential there for contribution, economic contribution, but still, once they get married and they have children, they're very hesitant about returning to the workforce. This is something that should be addressed by the Israeli government. A second group is ultra-Orthodox men, because we see among ultra-Orthodox women that they do enter the technological subjects and they do wonders in growing numbers. They're extremely successful. And now we would like to see more men from the ultra-Orthodox community following them, following their path. So these are the things that are happening in Israel. A lot is being done in order to encourage young girls already in high school, in middle school, in the periphery, to enter the technological professions and continue later on to the relevant military units, and from there straight to university.
Thank you, Gali. Michal, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What is Israel doing right? We've heard a lot, and again, some areas where we're weak. What are your thoughts? What we're doing right and wrong?
So first of all, thank you for this very, very important question. And actually, you said it's late, but I actually just left another Zoom in a global forum that engaged exactly on the topic of women in politics. And the importance of or at least what I refer to as the importance of the multiplicity of voices and viewpoint diversity around the table, and what women bring with them to every situation and around every decision-making table in terms of the multiple identities we bring with us. By the way, everybody brings with them that multiplicity or viewpoint diversity that's important around the table, but for the benefit of all and not for the benefit of women. So having served as a commissioner for the prevention of sexual harassment for several years, I found myself sometimes very frustrated speaking to my 200 colleagues from various institutions, academic institutions, companies, and so forth, and realizing we were speaking to ourselves about sexual harassment of women, mostly, primarily, and there were 200 women in the room, not one man to be counted, because all of the commissioners were women ultimately. And actually, part of the problem is that it's legislated that way. So very often it's encouraged that women be appointed to that role with an assumption that it's mostly women who get harassed, and therefore mostly women should be the ones appointed to the role. And therefore, I think that what we have to challenge ourselves as a society much more deeply, and I'll refer to a little bit of what Galit referred to with regards to the greatest equalizer that still exists in the state of Israel, and that is the army as well. But what I wanted to say is, I think that what we have to challenge ourselves as a society is to acknowledge that there are many hurdles and to remove them one by one. And that's, part of my role, certainly in the, Status for Women Committee. But sometimes it troubles me in the Status for Women Committee that I think to myself, we should be discussing this in the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee. We should be discussing this in the Law and Constitution Committee. And there are issues that come to the table at the Status for Women Committee. And I realize, again, we're sitting around the table, mostly women, although my father, as a sworn feminist in the Canadian Parliament, always went to those caucus meetings. Really, you can ask him. He was really an honorary member of the Women's Caucus. But there are very few men around the table at the end of the day, and that is a part of the problem and a part of the challenge. We are talking to ourselves about the challenges that we face, that we have, and that benefit ultimately the entire society if we're able to create authentic gender parity that is not based on affirmative action, but on our recognition of the viewpoint diversity and what it brings with it for all. And I like to give anecdotally, and I just gave it on the other Zoom actually, the example of 2015, as a, Canadian Israeli, an Israeli Canadian, the 2015 cabinet appointment of Prime Minister Trudeau at the time, who appointed a gender parity cabinet, and it was very clear. And so when the journalist asked him, Prime Minister, can I ask you, was this intended? I mean, how come you've appointed, this gender parity cabinet? And the Prime Minister looked as if he didn't understand the question. He sort of paused for a moment, and he looked at the journalist and said, because it's 2015. Now, I'll say, and here I sort of segue into my challenge to Israeli society, that I wrote at the time an article called "Because It's 2017 and We Are in 2020." The challenge for where women's voices lack, and I say it as a member of Knesset, actually coming from a party where we do have almost gender parity, but it happened randomly. When you look at the leadership of the parties, very often, my party included, there are men at the helm. And just to connect and to piggyback off what Galit said, part of the reason for that is that great equalizer is also deemed as the preparation for great leadership skills, rightly or wrongly. And actually, just a couple of weeks ago, maybe even last week, the time is, days are, anyway, they all mix in Knesset, but I think it was just last week that we held a very important meeting actually at the Security and Foreign Affairs Committee with regards to the integration of women to all roles in the army. And Galit referred to her military experience. When I went to the army, when I enlisted as a lone soldier, there was actually a women's corps, Chel Nashim. That's how I enlisted into the army. And I was an officer for all women. I basically met all new recruits, all women that entered the army. They went through, like, under my hands as an officer, a MMM and a MP, in a base that was called Baj Timesle, a base that was solely for women at the time. And lucky for me, I got to be in one platoon that we had off in, Nitzanim on another base. But mostly all of the courses, all of the new recruits, all of the women went through this women's corps. Well, we've come a long way once again. And I remind myself and all of us, the state of Israel is only 72 years old. So we have a ways to go for sure, and we are in a process. But at the time, actually, and Galit will remember, Alice Miller. Alice Miller was the first woman who demanded an equal right to be considered to become a pilot. Ultimately, she did not complete the course, but that wasn't the point. And she went and petitioned the Supreme Court of Justice. And so we just, at the meeting that we held last week, had 3 women around the table that petitioned the High Court of Justice after actually not, or what's called falling from training to become a pilot, right, and not receiving the same equal treatment or equal opportunities as their male counterparts that did not continue in the course, and that is why they petitioned the Supreme Court or the High Court of Justice. The importance of the ability to petition the High Court of Justice, and it's something that I speak of often in terms of the rule of law and Israel's real understanding and leadership that the court has taken, is important. I do challenge, and I would like us to challenge, that it is strictly military experience that prepares us for the kind of public and political roles that I wish there were more women of. And I'll say from my own experience, though I served in the army and so forth, but even if I had not, the fact that I bring with me a toolkit that relies very heavily on my understanding of international law and the imperative for Israel to affirm international law, to utilize the language of rights, the lingua franca spoken around the world, I don't think I would have had that as a military general. And in fact, I think that the voice that I bring around the table at the Chutz V'Bitachon, at the Foreign Relations and Security Committee, comes actually and challenges what military generals do, the experience they do bring. And that is not for 1 minute to minimize or undermine the experience, the important experience that they bring when they sit around the table. But it is to say that viewpoint diversity is imperative if the state of Israel is to address its challenges, both globally in the international arena and internally, in terms of our internal resiliency as a society and in our engagement with our sisters and brothers in diaspora. So I think that there is a skill set that military generals bring with them, and that the army for sure is the great equalizer, except that I question the fact that we have come to regard that skill set to be the one that's necessary, that's needed for political or public life in the state of Israel, I think that it actually dilutes the conversation. I think that it disables the state of Israel in terms of, I'll say from my perspective, the war waged against the state of Israel utilizing legal and public opinion mechanisms that has, I mean, if find expression, you mentioned, my role as the ICC representative in Knesset, not to the ICC, but internally in Knesset. It's exactly to shine a large spotlight on the fact that we are not speaking the lingua franca. And I don't mean English, the language of rights. We're not engaging with our counterparts. And by the way, they do not understand military language. They do not understand Israel's security needs, nor can they. And being able to say the exact same thing, being able to make accessible Israel's security concerns, utilizing a different language is imperative, considering the challenges that we face on the global stage and in many ways internally as well.
Michal, thank you. Yeah, I saw Gali nodding the whole time. So let me ask you again. Again, it's on this topic, and I want to know. I don't know if there's an answer to this, but over 50 years ago, Israel had a female prime minister. I mean, it's been, with the exception of Tzipi Livni, we have not had, and I think you've alluded to why, perhaps because of the bias towards moving towards the military generals, or that's. When is the next time? And again, I'll go back to you, Michal, and then we'll go over to Gali. When do we see another Golda Meir in Canada, or in Israel, excuse me, in Israel?
So first of all, when do we see her in Canada is a question as well. And I think what we need to be looking at is what we need to do in order to encourage women, and Galit referred to it before, empowering women from a very young age to realizing there is no glass ceiling. The sky isn't the limit, neither for my sons nor my daughter. And that's a very important moment to recognize that in Israel, and with the necessity, actually, this was shocking for me, moving with my 4 Canadian children. I thought I was never going to leave the house again. It took me a full year to be able to re-enter any kind of professional role because I committed to integrate them into society, and they were home by 12. That was one of the most fundamental challenges for my year when we returned. I mean, I had not attended school here. I didn't see it coming, and recognizing that we have to match the school day with a work day reality. I'd come from a reality where my children were at school at the time that we were both, my husband and I, at work, and it enabled family time, and it enabled a day off, an additional day off to Shabbat. And for those of us that keep Shabbat, that's a huge thing to be able to say that we need an additional day. And the alignment, and I would say in Israel, the misalignment of the work market with the school day or the school week is something that must be remedied across the board. It'll also enable what's most important to me, actually, not just the ability of women to integrate and men to integrate and increase their professional involvement, but ultimately it's mostly women. And maybe I'll just, with regards to what Galit said, with regards to Haredi women and with regards to the Arab sector, it would empower all women of all, groups to be able to integrate properly into the workforce, but also because it would enhance the level of public education in the state of Israel. And it would enable us to actually reform the curriculum to include everything that should be a part of the curriculum. And today happens in ungodly hours where parents are driving around children after work at 7 o'clock in the evening, at 8 o'clock in the evening, to gymnastics, to art. I really have to say that there is a need for a true reform. And where it used to work, and I wrote another article exactly about this when we moved here because I was in such shock, where it used to work because everybody had siesta, because it was very hot and there was no air conditioning, and everybody actually came home together, ate lunch, and went for a nap. And then children would go outside and play with whoever was there, and parents would go back to work. That is not the world we live in today. That is not 2020, speaking of 2020. And so we must adjust that. And I think that that is a fundamental change that needs to happen. I would say that, I say this about COVID-19 all the time. There are many opportunities alongside the challenges that I hope we have the wisdom to identify and actually be able to realize, not only with regards to coping with COVID-19 and the extensive challenges it's had, but in terms of long-term reform. It's interesting because one of the ways that the educational system has coped with COVID-19 should actually be the long-term return, right? It's smaller classrooms or longer days in more, we call them capsules, but more contained groups, and so that is to me one of the biggest challenges that we have. And for Golda Meir to come from this generation of children, we do have to address those challenges so that it's not just the opportunities that we continue to give all children, whether they're, and the word periphery actually makes me crazy in such a small country where there's no justification to have a backyard to the state of Israel. It's a tiny, tiny country. In order to address this and in order to ensure that gender parity is not just a numeric thing, but really a qualitative thing, not just quantitative, those are reforms we have to make.
Galit, would you like to add a little bit to that, please?
Well, I couldn't agree more. Definitely, I agree that when it comes to the education system, longer hours are an imperative, extremely important to allow women to work in peace. The pressure, when the children are young, the pressure generally lies on the shoulders of the mothers, less on the shoulders of the fathers, even if they participate and they support the family and they support their spouses. But again, I see what is happening at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I see at a certain point in the early afternoon when there is an exodus of women running out of the office, just completing things in the last minute and running to pick up their kids from kindergarten, from school. And of course, it's extremely challenging. My husband and I, as diplomats, have traveled around the world. We didn't have the luxury of family, of grandparents living nearby and helping in picking up the kids and supporting the family. And this is such a vital element in the life of every family in Israel. But it doesn't exist for many families. We mentioned here lone soldiers, olim, immigrants to Israel, families who live relatively far, again, in Israeli terms, and I couldn't agree more about the gap between the center and the periphery in a tiny country such as Israel. But there are many families that battle with this issue on a daily basis, and of course it's an impediment, and more support is required, is needed. I also think that it has to do with education and expectations. The way parents raise their children is extremely important. The way society supports young girls, allows them to express themselves freely is extremely important. I'll just give you an example that in some schools in Israel, there are separate programs in math for boys and girls together and for girls separately, because what happens, and this is an interesting phenomenon according to different studies, when girls who are very good at math reach middle school and high school, all of a sudden they become very shy, very self-confident, and you see boys raise their hands and answer questions, and they are seen and perceived as brilliant and knowledgeable, while girls tend to be very quiet. And in order to eliminate that, maybe separate groups, study groups should be created for girls to build their confidence, to nourish them, to nurture them, and to help them excel in these subjects. I believe this is part of it. Role models and definitely mentoring programs of women with younger girls. This is crucial. This is vital. It's already happening in governmental ministries, and I have to say about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, there are different fora, different work groups that were established for young cadets, for women who have recently joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and experienced diplomats such as myself and others. And it's important to set an example, to show young women in the army, in governmental ministries, in the most prestigious governmental agencies, that it's doable, that women can actually work, they can achieve, they can succeed, they can win their seat at the table with no favors, because they can earn that seat at the table. I saw that when I first of all when I served in Cairo, And mainly when I was director of the Department for Palestinian Affairs, again, a very masculine work environment. I was one of the very few women who participated in that discussion about security and about Israel's relations with the Arab world in general, with the Palestinians in particular. And I saw, and I was deeply impressed by the officers, by the IDF officers, women from the intelligence corps, who were so knowledgeable and so confident, and set a wonderful example of feminine excellence. And this is what young women should see. They should see more. I would dare say to Knesset member Kotler-Wunsch that more women like her are needed in the Israeli political system. You set an example, and you should encourage, and this is your responsibility as elected officials, to encourage more women to enter politics in Israel. Because I do believe that there is some hesitation. More should be done.
Michal, I'm not sure if you want to add. I mean, we could talk about this, and I don't want to take time away from you, but I want to be respectful of your time, and we've sort of limited to an hour. If there's something you'd like to add, or I wouldn't mind pivoting just a little bit, if that's all right. And I'll go back to Galit, if I may. Recently, Galit, you've been on, and I'm sure Michal is also, but on a number of Zoom calls about the UAE-Israel agreement. We've all heard about this. It's wonderful news. So much is going on in Bahrain, UAE, and who knows where else. But Galit, I'd like to ask you your thoughts. How can Canada participate in this? I mean, you're now situated here, you're seeing it from a distance. And again, as a diplomat who's interested and engaged, what can we do here in Canada? What can Canadian businesses, how can they intersect through all this? Your thoughts, please.
You vanished here for a second. There, okay. The wonders of technology, everything is held on Zoom now. When it comes to economic relations with Israel, and I'll talk about Israel-Canada relations, things are definitely changing. If in the past the Israeli business community tended almost automatically to go to the United States, now there is growing interest in the Canadian market, and we see more and more Israeli companies that are represented here, and they dare enter this new realm for economic development and trade and commerce. I believe this is wonderful. More should be done on both sides by Canadians representing your country back in Israel and by Israeli diplomats working here. I always include the economic aspect in every political meeting that I conduct here. There is a lot of curiosity, a lot of potential, all the way to Western Canada. It's people are aware of Israel and what it has to offer. When it comes to our relations in the Middle East, I believe that in the very near future, there will be new opportunities for not only for Israel and for local companies in the Gulf and in other parts of the Middle East, but also for international companies. We see what is happening now after the signing of the Abraham Accords between Israel, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, ongoing negotiations with other Muslim countries such as Sudan, and the growing curiosity in the Middle East, the realization that there is great potential of economic development, trade, tourism, and people-to-people relations in general between Israel and the Arab world. We see the delegations that have already visited Israel from the Gulf. Israelis are extremely curious about business opportunities. There are seminars, webinars, Zoom meetings that are conducted by the Israel Export Institute and other economic organizations in Israel to provide opportunities. And I do believe that Canadians could benefit from that indirectly, either through Israel and through their activity in the Gulf. Anything that could be done in order to provide or to expand economic cooperation will only contribute to regional stability. And I do believe that in the Middle East, prosperity is a key element in providing geopolitical stability as well.
Thank you. Michal, I know that it's not directly what you do every day, but love to hear it as a Canadian Israeli, your thoughts, please.
It's actually directly what I do in many ways. Right. And I'll say why. We've had the opportunity to engage and actually with parliamentarians around the world just about this. We have all kinds of formal and informal. People are less familiar with that sort of opportunities to engage, and actually Zoom has made that all the more relevant. So whether it's Canada-Israel Friendship Group, as you mentioned, but there are actually many forums forums or parliaments of parliaments, if you will, the European Parliament, the OSCE, the IPU. And I don't want to repeat anything that Galit just said. Of course, the importance and the imperative and the opportunity that I believe that this, what I would say, historic potential paradigm shift holds. And I'll say what I spoke about and what I speak about very often, including in my engagements with people from UAE, from Bahrain, and from around the world, and from Europe. And I would say Canada has an important role in this as well. And that is the recognition of what I call, or what I refer to as, the historic pivot from the 3 no's of Khartoum: no to recognition, no to negotiation, and no to peace with Israel, to the 3 yeses: yes to recognition, yes to negotiation, and yes to peace with Israel. And for me, the order of those is very, very important. The understanding, and where I say the potential historic paradigm shift, the recognition that the pivot from rejectionism to normalization actually took those 3 yeses in that order, that they are based on mutual recognition, is something that we should not balk at or take for granted for a moment. Because really, when you think about it, the paradigm that has guided thus far has been sort of the opposite: peace, negotiation, recognition. Where, and it's very important to say this, in any other human relations, the first thing we need to do is recognize each other's right to exist as who we are. And in this case, it is as Israel, as Jewish and democratic. That is what we were created to be. And until the moment that, and actually one of the first bills that I proposed is the Basic Law Declaration of Independence, because I believe that it holds many answers to what ails us and challenges us in many ways, internally in Israel, in terms of Israel-diaspora relations, and in terms of Israel standing in the international arena. And where I say Canada has a role, the EU has a role, the international community has a role, it's the recognition that Israel in any borders, and I say this, of course there are challenges, but Israel in any borders, and whatever they may be, they should be, actually must first be recognized. Its right to exist, its very legitimacy cannot continue to be questioned, and then we skip over that and say, okay, and now peace and prosperity. There is no way for peace and prosperity without mutual recognition that enables negotiation and that builds upon peace. And I think that that's a very important historic shift that we see, and what Galit referred to in the people to people, and even in the understanding, and this is very important to sort of note, Bahrain actually adopted, not officially, but elements in Bahrain adopted the IRA working definition for anti-Semitism, which as we know, about 30 countries around the world have adopted IRA in its entirety. And IRA in its entirety includes what we know as, the 3 Ds: delegitimization, demonization, double standards towards the state of Israel. That is a very important aspect of recognition, of mutual recognition. And it also beckons that the international community, Canada included, as what I consider and Canada considers to be the beacon of human rights, the trustee of international law. It must be called upon to stop the singling out of the state of Israel, to stop enabling the double standards that actually not only encourage but empower the culture of impunity of terror regimes such as that of Iran. And I separate the terror regime of Iran from the people of Iran, and terror regimes such as those holding 2 million civilians in Gaza hostage, the terror regime of Hamas, a genocidal terror regime who, alongside with 2 million civilians, are actually holding 2 Israeli deceased soldiers, 2 Israeli civilians in violation, standing violation, 6+ year standing violation of international law, of an international humanitarian ceasefire brokered by the EU, by the UN and the United States, supported by the EU. So it's imperative, when I say it's imperative that we come with a skill set to sit around the table, that we affirm international law, that we utilize the language of rights. That's precisely what I mean in terms of our engagements as parliamentarians with our peers from around the world when we address these issues. And when, just the other day, I engaged with the European Parliament and insist that when we sign a joint interparliamentary memorandum of understanding, then it include that IRA in its entirety must guide, by the way, also the funding that is provided by those European countries. It cannot be funding that goes to supporting terror, and then the state of Israel can assist in counterterrorism activity. It's just, that's double standards. And those are the issues that, as a non-diplomat, I get to say them around the table very openly, because I'm engaging with my peers, fellow parliamentarians around the world, and that is a huge incredible, powerful tool that we need to maximize. So when I'm appointed, for example, by the Knesset spokesperson to engage the ICC, it's to engage with the very countries that are state parties to the ICC about the imperative for ICC reform, those funding the ICC because it is not fulfilling and upholding its mandate to protect peoples around the world in a world of again and again, when its mandate is never again, but its obsessive singling out of the state of Israel doesn't permit it to address the real violations of human rights around the world. And that is not to say that the state of Israel is perfect. It's just that we cannot continue sitting on the docket of the accused and responding and reacting. We need to take the lead on this and rise from the docket of the accused and improve everything that needs to be improved. And in that sense, you know, we're marking now what will be another beating that Israel takes at the UN. 17 UN resolutions will be passed against the state of Israel, and the rest of the world will see 7. All of, you know, Syria, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela. Those are things that we need to call Canada to task for as well. Canada included, and as you know, I'm sure, it is a role that Canada can, and I would say must, take in that sense, ensuring and assuring that human rights are indeed upheld, promoted, and protected, that international law is not abused by, you know, non-state actors that are terror regimes, that are terror organizations using and abusing the benefits of international law without respecting the rules such as reciprocity, such as complementarity, and so forth.
Thank you so much. I'd like to sneak in one more quick question. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I don't know if either one of you can give a quick answer to this one, but we all know what happened, or many of us are aware of what happened in the Knesset yesterday, and it appears that Israel is now headed for its 4th election in 2 years. When I have friends who say to me, why can't Israel get its act together? Help me out. Michal, I'll start with you. You're there day in and day out. I mean, Galit's a little from a distance, but maybe give me some thoughts on that.
On this, Galit may be able to be less diplomatic than I am. I'll say this. I'll say, look, we're in a process, Oded. And as I said, the miracle that is the state of Israel, and you know, this morning I received hundreds of Ethiopians that were waiting in camps in Addis Ababa and in Gondar, and every time I have a moment like that, then I know exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing. And when I see the reaffirmation of the mission, vision, and values of this country come to life in that way, and cannot help shed a tear when actually the Minister of Aliyah and Klita that brings them is Pnina Tamnoshete, who herself emigrated to Israel at the age of 3 from Ethiopia, then we have a lot to be proud of. We also have a lot to work on. We are a work in progress. And I think the indication to that, or I'd say these continued elections and inability to create a stable government is part of that process. Now, I had hoped, and I still believe that entering this unity government, from my perspective, and joining blue and white in entering this unity government is a step along the process. I believe that deeply. I will say that I think that the way is longer than I might have first set out to believe, but we have no choice. We have much responsibility and so much to still do. As I said, so much to be proud of. Now, part of it is the parliamentary system. Part of it is actually good news. And I know that sounds a little bit funny. It's terrible news that we have to go to election, by the way, in the middle of an economic, societal, health crisis of which the likes of the state of Israel has not seen. Close to 1 million unemployed, tens of thousands of businesses going under. So not for a second do I wish, or did I wish, that we would be going or possibly going to another election. And the reason for entering this unity government was not just a technical unity government, it was an authentic need for unity, internal unity and cohesion for Israeli society. But I will say where a little bit of hopeful message that I have, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention Rabbi Lord Sachs, who just passed away and whose voice is so missing already in my life, certainly, and I think in all of our lives. he speaks and he distinguishes between hope and optimism. And hope, he says, is actually a very active form, whereas optimism is passive. Hope requires a lot of courage. And I'm very hopeful. And I'll say where. I think that the 3 election campaigns, and hopefully we're not headed to a 4th one, and we can manage to create some sort of a functioning government that passes a budget. But where it does leave us in a world, when I look around at the world and I see a very polarized world, actually, the good news is the majority of Israelis, probably about 80% of us, agree about at least 80% of the issues, at least 80% of the time. And that is where we're having a very hard time. Now, I don't personalize or politicize issues, not the law and not anything else. But I think we are struggling with that internally as a society. And it's a reflection and intersects with global processes that actually affect, in many ways, what's happening in the state of Israel. And my own hope is that we do find a way at this very difficult time to resolve this, to create a possibility for a state budget, which we need, because I say long-term plans, but I'm looking at 1 year ahead, 2021, that's all. And Galit can attest to the fact that the ministries cannot function. I can tell you that the committees I sit on, whether the ones that I chair or otherwise, nobody can function without a budget. You can't run a household without a budget. And the state of Israel is in dire need of a budget. So we are committed to getting that done. Elections will not bring us closer, sadly, to a budget. And so I do hope that this is resolved. But that is sort of the hopeful message that I have, is it really is an indication that we are much closer together, including minorities, by the way. There's very interesting processes happening in the Joint Arab List as well. We are coming closer and closer together rather than further and further apart. It's just that the voices at the polarized ends are usually the loudest, especially in this digital age that we live in. But we are in a process. We are a work in progress.
Oh, thank you. Galit, I'm going to give you the last word before I finish out.
The main thing that I can say as a diplomat representing Israel abroad, that I've been very fortunate to meet here different representatives of Israeli society, not only elected officials. I'm fortunate to meet here Israeli artists, filmmakers, representatives of non-governmental organizations, elected officials, of course, university professors, experts in their fields, writers, musicians. They represent the different facets, different voices of Israeli society. And I see it as my responsibility as a diplomat, not only to represent the government of Israel or the Knesset, but also to represent society as a whole. And it's a plethora of voices and views and opinions. And one thing that unites all of them, Jews and Arabs alike, is love of the land, love of the country, and the willingness and the desire to represent their country well. And they come and they do it wholeheartedly with great devotion. And this is something very impressive. I believe it shows the resilience and the strength of Israeli democracy. We're going through challenging times due to the political situation, COVID, the economic crisis. There is an ongoing heated discussion. We conduct it in our unique Israeli style. And you know, I love it. I believe this is part of being Israeli. And sometimes it seems that we won't be able to deal with these many challenges, but we will, because we have the strength and we have the resilience. Our society is strong enough, and Israeli citizens love their country, and they will do what is right. And I would like just to end with reminding all of us the words of Golda Meir, former Prime Minister of Israel, was asked about the political situation and the regional situation and the endless challenges that Israel is dealing with. And she said that Israelis don't have the luxury of being pessimistic. So we're not going to be pessimistic. We are optimistic, and we count on our elected officials to do what is right and to represent our country well.
That's well said. Thank you so much. So Michal, Galit, I mean, we've gone a little bit over time. We've only touched on so many topics. So first of all, I want to thank you both so much. There were some questions we didn't get to. I actually got a number of texts that I'm reading through about how people were thrilled at the passion, at the way the both of you speak. And again, I personally want to thank you so much for your time. I want to wish you and all our members and guests who said, first of all, happy Hanukkah. We're almost on the Festival of Lights. So happy Hanukkah, season's greetings to those who are not Jewish. All the best. Thank you so much, both. Galit, I'll look forward to seeing you in Toronto, hopefully personally. And Michal, again, thank you so much. Good night. Thank you again for coming. And everybody, we'll look forward to seeing you at our next events. Be well, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.